welcome back everybody to Satisfactionist Live. I am your host, Ben Olmos, and today we are going to be diving into what I think is a very important and kind of topic of the moment of today. And we are going to be diving into the Electoral College and what it is all about. Some of the it's been a very interesting topic as of late, and so hope you guys enjoy listening to this. Joining me today for this episode is my expert panelist, Mr. George C. Edwards III. He is a scholar of political science, and you'll read in the show introduction, George has a really extensive background in all of this. George, how are you today?
I'm fine. Nice to be here.
No, nice to have you. Thank you so much. And I was mentioning this before we got started, but I love your background. I love the fact that you've got a ton of books there behind you. And
Yes,
I'm sure a few of those are written by you.
I've written a few, yeah.
Well, George, just real quick before we get started, do you mind just kind of lightly going over? You have a really deep background and experience in this, but as it relates to the Electoral College and some of the stuff we're going to get into today, maybe some of your experiences that kind of bring us to this topics.
Well, I think I've been a presidential scholar for nearly a half a century, and I think it was the 2000 election that got me particularly interested in this. And I should say I was close to George H.W. Bush, 41, the president, and being a presidential scholar, and his presidential libraries outside my window. So, and that was part of my legacy is bringing it to our campus. At any rate, and I'm very proud of that. And so I loved him. At any rate, his son won election in 2000, but with fewer votes. And so I said, this bothers me. This violates some fundamental norms of democracy. And so the question is, can we justify it? There's no question it violates political equality because all votes don't count equal. If all votes counted equal, the candidate with the most votes wins. But clearly that's not what happened. And so I said, I knew how the Electoral College worked, and I'd explained it to people over the years, but I said, I think I should dive into this and reevaluate. And so I did. And what I found was that there were many, many justifications have been offered over the years for the Electoral College. But when I evaluated them, I found that every one of them was faulty. It was built on a foundation of faulty premises. And so I wrote a book about the Electoral College that now in the third edition from Yale University Press, called Why the Electoral College is Bad for America. And so you can understand where I came out on this. But it took me quite a while to go through each one of the premises, if you will, that had been offered as a justification for the Electoral College, and then to subject them to some rigorous scrutiny and to see whether or not actually the claims that were made were true. And it turned out that they weren't. I don't mean that those making the claims were liars. I don't mean that at all. I mean they were just wrong. They hadn't actually evaluated. They just made a claim and left the field. That's not good enough. It's certainly not good enough for scholarship, and it shouldn't be good enough for citizens either.
And so when you talk about the claims that were being made, this is really you're saying the logic, if you will. So oftentimes in scholarly works, when you submit it to a panel of experts, a body of folks kind of review the data and go through it. And you did a little bit of that yourself, and you found that the logic arguments that were proposed were not necessarily sound.
Correct. That's right.
So what, as it stands today, for folks who may not be as up to speed on the Electoral College and how it works currently, and the arguments, maybe some of the more popular ones, because as I understand, there are many. How does it work today, and what were some of the arguments to support it?
Well, the way it works today is that electors are by and large party agents. It works nothing like the founding the founding fathers anticipated. It doesn't work at all that way. So we can't say, well, boy, they were smart. They had a great idea, so we don't want to mess with that. That doesn't make any sense because it doesn't operate at all like they thought it was going to operate. They thought that electors would have complete independence and could vote any way they chose. And there weren't any political parties when the Constitution was written, so they weren't party agents. And the states just chose electors and allowed them to vote, and they did. They voted in all kinds of different ways for all kinds of different candidates. And they anticipated that actually no one would get a majority of the vote most of the time. They knew Washington would become the first president, but after that they didn't know. And they thought it would go to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives would actually choose the president from those who had done well in the original electoral voting. So anyhow, that's how they anticipated that it would work. But it doesn't work that way at all. So each state, well, 48 of the 50 states have decided that they are going to cast all of their electoral votes for whomever comes in first. This is the big problem at the core of the problem with the Electoral College. And this started once political parties developed and the dominant party in a state said, hey, why should we not have everything? So if we get 50% plus one vote, we're going to get 100% of the electoral votes. Well, as you can immediately see, there's a problem then in the translation of individual votes into electoral votes. And that's why a candidate can lose the popular vote and win the electoral vote. And if you think about this last election that occurred in November, Donald Trump lost by 7 million votes. That's a lot of votes. A clear feat, 7 million votes. But if there had been a switch of 45,000 votes over 3 states, Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, he would have won election. He would have been reelected, even though he still would have lost by 7 million votes. And that's the problem. So if you win some states by very narrow margins and lose other states by large margins, you can win the presidency. Excuse me, my phone is ringing. I'm turning it off as best I can.
No problem. No
I
problem.
apologize. At any rate, and that is the big source of the problem. So twice this century, we have had the candidate who came in second win the presidency, and of course, it's happened at other times in American history as well.
It seems, though, that something that you alluded to previously was the fact that prior to our modern day politics, there were more political parties out there. And as you mentioned, when the country was first founded, we really didn't have the kind of duopoly in politics that we do today. And because I think of that duopoly, I think there's probably now more than ever the opportunity to kind of revamp this whole thing. I don't necessarily know that popular vote should be the way, because it feels to me that you have to give every state a voice in the process. And if it's just popular, then all of the coastal states will seem to kind of, drive the process forward.
Well, that's an interesting proposition, and many people think that at first glance. But when you think about it, that's not what actually happens. So in the real world, we can look at how the states vote, right? And if you look at the 11 biggest states, which are the ones which would have a majority, they could elect a president just because of their size under the Electoral College, all right? If you just add up the votes in the 11 biggest states, it's very close between Democrats and Republicans. We can elect across this century, for example. So they don't dominate. If they all voted in one direction, if 100% of their voters voted in one way, then they would be able to. But that's not what actually happens in the real world, because you got California, but then you got Texas, you got Florida, the third biggest state, highly competitive, right? So there's lots of competition. And actually, it's under the Electoral College allows the big states to dominate. Because if you win each of the 11 biggest states by one vote, you win the presidency, even if you lose every other vote in the nation. And what happened in 2016 is Donald Trump won 7 of the 11 biggest states. And he won the presidency while losing the election. He won it by winning the big states. So it's exactly the opposite of what those who say, "Oh, well, the big states will dominate in a popular election." It's exactly the opposite of what really happens.
So, how do you get away from this? Because I know, I was reading there's been multiple proposals to modify or change the way that we do things. And a while back, I was listening to Freakonomics podcast, and they were talking about a proposal of even doing like a multi-vote where you pick your first, second, third, maybe fourth choice candidate, and
Right.
then we tally the votes from there. And then, if the fourth one loses, then all the votes roll over to the third one,
Right.
et cetera. So, I mean, what are the kind of proposals that are out there? And realistically, given that it's kind of baked into our way of doing things, is it something that could even change?
Well, it can change. And in fact, there is a proposal to change the way it works without changing the Constitution, because it's difficult to amend the Constitution. And that's called the National Popular Vote Plan. And that is a set of agreements among the states, interstate compact, in which states agree that they will give their electoral votes to whoever comes in first in the nation. And states representing, and I would have to double check at the about 180 electoral votes have agreed to this, have signed on to this. If it hits 270, then you've changed it, because then it will become a national popular vote, and that means you just add up the votes. So the simplest and the most straightforward way is to add up all the votes in the country. What you were just talking about from Freakonomics is ranked voting, and that has a lot to offer, but I don't think that's the place to start, because it's too complicated for many people to understand. It's actually simple in principle, but for most people, it's going to be too complicated. And so, but the one thing that we know how to do in this country, because we've done it thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times, is elect people by adding up all the votes, and whoever gets the most votes wins. I mean, you would never imagine having an election for governor of your state, any state, and say, "I'll tell you what we're going to do. Whoever comes in second, they're going to be governor." You'd say, that's crazy, right? We elect every governor, every senator, every member of Congress, state. That's how we elect people. That's how we elect people. We add up the votes, and whoever gets the most votes wins. Amazing. What a concept, right? So the one office that we don't do this for is the President of the United States. And as I said when we began, you have to have some justification for allowing the candidate who comes in second to win. You have to have some justification more than other people's votes. And I can't think of any. There is no theorist of democracy, not one, who's ever advocated anything like that. Everyone says at the heart of democracy, at the heart of the whole notion of what a democracy is equality in voting. And I think you have to have a very good reason to overturn that principle, to violate that principle. And that's why I said you have to look at the justifications that have been offered for the Electoral College, things it's supposed to do for the country to compensate for that violation, because it clearly violates. Everyone agrees that it violates the principle. And the question really is there a compensation for that violation? And I think there is not when you examine the justifications that are offered.
So how then, if you are is this something that you feel has to happen at the state level, that almost kind of grassroots within the states, and then roll it up from there, kind of getting rid of delegates as they are today?
Well, of course, there's no justification to have electors. I mean, there absolutely nobody can justify having electors exist. There's nobody who does, because the only thing they can do is cause mischief. If they do what they're told to do, then they're automatons, and if they don't, they cause mischief, and they take it into their own hands to vote in ways that the people of their state did not vote. So there's no justification for them. Okay, so I think that yes, we have to educate the public. It's Electoral College. Once you understand it, it's pretty simple how it works. But there are many rules and regulations that we just noticed as we've gone through a certification of votes in Congress that we normally is quite routine, and this time around was not. So people need to be educated so they understand what it is and what the consequences are. But we do know for decades, the Gallup poll has been asking people, do you think we should have a direct election of the president? And that means add up all the votes, and whoever gets the most votes wins. And in every poll, a majority of the public has said yes. And in more recent times, other polling organizations have been asking the question as well. Now, unfortunately, in this century, and particularly after 2016, it's become a partisan issue because Republicans have found that they are benefiting from the Electoral College, and they are winning elections that they otherwise wouldn't win. And the Republicans know perfectly well. If you just think about American history, in 1992 and 1996 and 2000 and 2008 and 2012 and 2016 and in 2020, the Democrats got the most votes for president. Nevertheless, during that period, and now that's becoming a reasonably long period, almost 30 years, right? Nevertheless, in that time, the Republicans have been able to, and the Republicans have got the most votes once in 2004. But they've won 3 of those elections, right? 2 of them because of the what I consider the malfunction of democracy in the Electoral College. So they have an incentive, and it's become a polarized issue, and it's become a partisan issue. That's unfortunate because it may not. This is short-term thinking. It may not always benefit the Republicans, and so it's better to think in terms of principles and not in terms of short-run political gain. That's hard for many people to conceive of, doing that, and particularly elites, because, well, I'm here, and I want power now.
Right.
I'm not concerned about 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 100 years from now. I want power now. So it is difficult to convince people to vote on the basis of principle, but that's why you write books, and that's why I'm happy to be a guest on your show tonight and to talk about such things.
Well, and I really appreciate that, by the way. You know, when I think about the rhetoric that is out there about folks constantly saying, the system is broken, constantly saying that we've got to work across party lines and be bipartisan. And then that seems great. And then the elections end and we go kind of right back to our normal ways. What you're speaking of almost kind of forces us a little bit to have a little bit more bipartisanship. I mean, if folks feel in mass that a Democratic president is really inevitable, as you kind of laid out there, then it does kind of force the Republican Party to be a little more, kind of work with you a little bit more. Right now, it's just really, it's kind of a statistical strategy game where you go in and you just try and win the places that are most important that take you over 270.
Right. One of the consequences of the Electoral College is that the candidates ignore almost everybody. They ignore 2/3 of the country. They ignore 2/3 of the population, and they spend almost all their time both in the advertisements and in their personal campaign appearances in a few states. And actually, more than half is generally in 4 states. Florida being an example, Pennsylvania being another one, Michigan being, in other words, the big competitive states, the swing states. North Carolina is now getting attention because it's getting sizable and competitive.
Yeah, but
So,
when's the last time somebody went to Utah or
oh, that's right. That's right. So we know because I've been tracing now. This last election was anomalous because of the pandemic. So I don't want to generalize from this last election, but we've been tracing. I personally have been tracing for some time exactly where every candidate goes every day from the day they accept the nomination to election day through election day. And we know that they ignore most of the states, and they particularly ignore the small states. So this doesn't help small states. Electoral College is nothing for small states. I mean, it's trivial. They don't get attention. Nobody visits them. Nobody's doing something special to win their votes unless they happen to be competitive.
yet the argument is always if we get rid of the electoral college, then the small states have no voice.
Yeah, but they have no voice now. You can't do worse than nothing. You cannot do worse than nothing, and now it's nothing. They get nothing. I mean, you can go right up the middle of the country. Think of, I'm in Texas, right? So above Texas, you got Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota. When is anybody? I mean, there's the heartland, right?
Right.
Nobody shows up. Nobody.
Well, I'm in Georgia, and we got a lot of attention this year.
Of course, well deserved. Yes, yes.
But yeah, I mean, it is very interesting to imagine kind of this an election race where we're not, um, you know, pretty much, it's kind of, I think of Tim Russert, drawing the map, drawing the board, and just kind of counting up, where we think it's going to go. And I
Right.
love the point that you made is the fact that when we elect senators or congressmen, um, oftentimes they span multiple zip codes. It would be like having a representative for every zip code or every county, depending upon the density of your state, being an elector and then going to the state government and saying, okay, my zip code votes for this person because that's what most of the
Right.
people.
Right.
It is a little
Well,
ridiculous.
if you think about what, you raised the very interesting point. What would it look like if we had direct election of the president? What would a campaign look like? Well, I think we know what it would look like. And we can start by making inferences from the way that gubernatorial candidates campaign. So in your state, there's one major population center and a few other much smaller population centers, and then some rural areas.
Right.
My state is vast, but it has big urban centers and then vast areas which are not big urban centers. So you can ask, well, when somebody's running for governor, do they just in Georgia, do they just campaign in Atlanta? I mean, that's the efficient thing to do, right? That's that, right? Well, of course, that's not true, right? You know that's not true, and I know that's not true, and it's not true in Texas. I mean, there are other places to go besides Houston and Dallas, right? And San Antonio. So they go all over the state. And they go all over the state because there's votes there and it's cost efficient, and they campaign and they advertise all across the state. Now, what would presidential candidates do? Again, they would go to the whole country. They would advertise across the whole country. And they wouldn't ignore right now rural areas are ignored by presidential candidates. They don't go to rural states. They just don't go. They don't go, with the one exception of Omaha in Nebraska, which occasionally they get some attention. But that's not the rural part. That's the non-rural part of Nebraska. And Nebraska divides up its electoral votes. So you can win one, and that's exactly what happened. Joe Biden won Omaha. Barack Obama won Omaha in one of his elections as well. So one electoral vote. That's all it takes. When there's votes you can actually win, candidates go, even if just one. And that tells you a lot. So they would campaign across the whole country. So it makes sense. California's been ignored for years and years and years. California, 11% of the population, much bigger percent of the entire economy is in California. They get no attention. Now, how does that make sense? Under what system is that a good idea? New York gets ignored, Texas gets ignored, Illinois gets ignored. There's 4 of the 5 biggest states we ignore. Does that make sense? Is that a good idea? I mean, how can we possibly justify it? So yes, they would compete there. But why wouldn't you compete in Wyoming, to take the smallest state? The cost of advertisements is based, as anybody in politics knows, on audience size, right? So it doesn't cost more to get 10,000 votes in Wyoming and to seek 10,000 votes in Wyoming than it does in Brooklyn. In fact, it probably costs less. So it's cost efficient to go to rural areas. Now, it's a vast country, and candidates only have so many days. So they are not going to show up in every small rural town in America. They don't now, zero, and they won't under direct election. But they will campaign much more broadly. And if they do that, what do we know that happens when they actually campaign and have campaigns and get out the turn out the vote efforts and have a lot of advertisements informing people of where they stand on the issues? Well, we know. We have lots and lots of studies. That's why we have a discipline called political science. We know a lot about this. We've been studying it for years, and we know that when those things happen, voters are better informed. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing for democracy. Moreover, they turn out to vote. When there are turnout to vote efforts, they turn out to vote. And by God, George has just shown us an extraordinary effort of turning out to vote, right? And
Yeah.
that's what people are supposed to do. They're supposed to vote. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. We turn out to vote. And when people know that their votes will count, right now in California, okay, we know how it's going to go. In Texas, for a long time, we've known how it's going to go, right? So people have no incentive. They can easily rationalize it's a wasted vote. I'm just wasting my time here because no matter what I do, I know how Texas is going to go. I know how California is going to go, etc. So why should I bother? That's not good for democracy. We want to provide incentives for people. So if every vote will count, and we're adding up votes from Massachusetts, from Boston to Austin, etc., right? Then that's good for democracy. That's how democracy is actually supposed to work.
No, I like that. It's interesting because when I first came across this topic and I thought about, my own feelings about it, I tended to kind of fall on my legacy thinking, the kind of institutional thinking, I guess you could say, because it's what I was raised up with, and you just kind of get this feeling like, well, this is always done, and if you do it different, then you're kind of destroying what it's been, but only to find out that it wasn't really designed to be the way that it is today. That we really kind of taken the voice away from the people. And your example of California and you get to a point where you're like, well, if you are a conservative in California, kind of what's the use? Because most, your delegates are going to end up going to the opposing party. And so, even I've kind of evolved in my own thinking around this. And I have to say, I mean, going into our conversation today, I was even like, I don't know, is the popular vote the thing to do? But you really are kind of swaying my thinking on that, because nobody running for president in the last 20 years that I can think of, very few people have gone to, we can talk about Alaska and Hawaii, but like even just middle of the country states, the plain states. Yet time and time again, one of the things I see on Facebook and the such is you can't change it because you'll eliminate the voice of the little guy. But I think you've made a very clear case that that's not necessarily true.
Right. Well, they have no voice. I would add one thing for those who are interested in changing. And concerned about changing the constitutional system, etc. If you think about it, putting the first 10 amendments aside, which were introduced as soon as we became a country and actually were ratified in 1791, all right, there's been very few amendments. There's been 17. 5 of those amendments were to increase democracy, increase who could vote. Right? By, I'm saying making more democratic, but I want listeners to understand, I mean with a small d. They are increasing democracy. So prohibiting discrimination on race and gender, poll taxes, lowering the voting age. We also had a further amendment that increased democracy again by allowing people to vote for the Senate. Now that was a 20th century, right? That's a 20th century amendment. So it took a long time, but this is a good thing. It fundamentally changed the system. So we've got one more office to deal with. We've dealt with the voters, we dealt with the Senate, and allowed the voters to actually choose senators. And now we need to take the final step and allow the public, a majority of the public, or at least the plurality of the public, to choose the president. That's the final step in the democratization of America. And I don't think anybody wants to go back. Who wants to take the vote away from women? I mean, that's a crazy idea to begin with, right? So nobody wants to do that. We don't want to go back on any of these. We want to keep moving forward.
So when you think about kind of what is, I guess you can say what has transpired recently, there's a lot of kind of growing misinformation about vote, about really even how the process, can be changed, can be altered. I mean, this election cycle, we heard a lot of claims about voter fraud. I personally am of the opinion of, are there chances that there are votes that get introduced that shouldn't be there? Probably, because it's such a big system. However, I also don't think it would have been in the numbers that would have made any significant difference. I mean, you mentioned, 7 million votes, and maybe even 45,000 of them possibly being incorrect. I don't know that that's in the realm of possibility. Maybe the reason we had so many votes this time, I would say probably the reason we had so many votes this time is because we had mail-in voting due to COVID. Do you, and maybe this is really kind of what I'm trying to ask is, do you see the process that we went through recently being reintroduced again in the future, or somehow building confidence in it so that we don't go down this road of votes are illegitimate,
Right.
or they were tampered with, or it's
Right.
any of that?
Well, that's a good question. There are several aspects of that. First of all, the we have no evidence of fraud, right?
Right.
There's just no evidence of fraud. I mean, Georgia, I think, when all its auditing and 2 recounts found 2 people who might have double voted or something. I mean, 2, right, out of millions. And no state has yet found anything. No state. The Trump campaign could not offer evidence to the courts, and the judges were scathing in their responses to these lawsuits, including judges nominated by Donald Trump.
Right.
So, but the Electoral College provides an incentive for fraud, because in a close state, you just have to steal a few votes, and you change it. You get everything. You get 100%, right? And in effect, you get 100% of the vote from that state by stealing a few votes. But in the country, and that's what we see in this election. If the Trump campaign could have stolen 45,000 votes, I'm not saying they did. I'm not suggesting it at all. But if they could have stolen 45,000 votes across 3 states, Trump would have been elected president. But in direct election, it wouldn't have mattered, because he lost by more than 7 million votes.
Right.
So there's not the same incentive for fraud. So the Electoral College provides an incentive for fraud. Second of all, the Electoral College has all these other elements that we've just seen in efforts to overturn and violate democratic principles, and overturning both when the electors voted in the state capitals and when the votes were opened in the United States Congress. Now, in direct election, there'd be none of this. They'd be gone. There'd be no electoral votes, no electors, no electoral votes, no need to certify that. You add up the votes. States can certify the vote totals. That's all they have to do. That's all they have to do. So there's no ability to not recognize one group of electors and come in with an alternative group of electors. There are no electors. So you don't have that. Now another aspect of the question that you asked me was, do I think that these efforts to increase voting participation, increase the ease of voting, will remain? And I think the answer basically is yes. Despite all the criticism, which is mostly lies, they have worked very well. If we can't find fraud, if nobody can find fraud, and just tell me the names of 100 people, 160 million people voted for president. Tell me the names of 100 people, across in the entire country. I mean, that's not that hard, right? And the Trump campaign has every single U.S. attorney. It's got the just part. It controls states like Georgia. I mean, the Republican Party is in control of Georgia, right? And they can't find fraud.
Yeah.
So that's a myth. It's unfortunate, but there isn't fraud. So it actually worked, and it increased participation. And I think it actually sensitized us to some of the problems that do occur in the ease and in making voting easy and convenient for people. And some efforts that were made, like in Texas, the governor decided, well, we can only have one drop-off box, one per county. Now, in a rural county, maybe that makes sense. At the courthouse or something like that, that may make sense. But one for Houston? I mean, one for Houston, the fourth biggest city in the country? I mean, that's crazy. And so that many people view as an effort at vote suppression. You're making it less convenient for voters in Houston to cast their ballots. And of course, the governor of Texas is a Republican. The voters in Houston are Democrats. So we have to be continuously alert to this kind of effort, which might have been motivated, by a desire to suppress some of the vote. And I think we're thinking about that much more now, and that's great. And I think that we can have good discussions about how many days after the election should we allow for mail-in ballots to be counted. Meaning, because you can vote on election day by mail, and it will take a few days. And some states, like Utah, I mean, it's a couple of weeks that they allow. Well, I don't know what the perfect day is. I just don't know.
Right. But
I don't know how far election observers should be from those counting the votes. I don't know how many feet. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. It's perfectly sensible to talk about that. It's perfectly sensible to talk about how many days do you have to come in to correct an error you made, by not signing all the places on your mail-in ballot. Okay, these are technical questions which reasonable men and women can discuss and come to some terms with, right?
Right.
But we can't get back to the old days of suppressing votes or trying to give one party an advantage in the rules of voting. That's wrong.
Well, yeah, and I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I think one of the things, I tend to on my show get into a lot of different subjects, and I always tell people I'm an independent, but I'm kind of center right. Whereas some of the topic we just talked about recently was around big tech, was the last show that we did, and in those regards, I tend to not like a lot of things that are so large that they almost shape the narrative of what should be. So big technology can be very intrusive and can do that. I mean, as I mentioned, they use behavioral science in very negative ways, and um, we are learning more and more about kind of the addiction qualities of technology and things of that nature. I think that what we've seen since the birth of social media is a lot of manipulation in the way that people perceive and understand information, such to the point that we had, what we did recently, where people honestly thought that they were going to overturn the election, and they went and stormed the Capitol. Um, it's a little nutty, but it made a lot of sense to them. So when I think about these efforts to improve the voting system, to open it up, to make people feel like they should vote, that they should, uh, that their vote matters, and that yes, mail-in voting does exist, but are there better ways that we can do it? And granted, I just got done bashing big tech, but there's a part of me that also thinks, like, why can't we have an app on our phone that allows us to vote? Because there's all sorts of ways to authenticate users. And then, the other argument would be, well, there's also lots of ways to uh, you know infiltrate that technology, and that then becomes the concern. Or maybe we just go back to the old ballot punch box and put it on paper, make it a Scantron form. um, so when you think about the fact that we've opened it up more, we've done uh, with mail-in voting, and with this last election, we got a huge amount of participation. How do you think that we keep that momentum up while at the same time tamping down what is come to mind with people with the thoughts of fraud and such?
Well, the enthusiasm for voting on both sides this time is driven, of course, by Donald Trump. Support for Donald Trump and, frankly, hatred of Donald Trump.
Sure.
Right? So and I don't know how you duplicate that, and I'm not even sure I want to. But I certainly like voting participation as a general principle. Now, on the other side is the issue of these undemocratic, again, small d, orientation of people who would storm the Capitol and try to pressure members of Congress to overturn duly elected electors, right? Electoral votes sent by the state of Georgia, and we want to overturn them. We don't want what the governor and the secretary of state, et cetera, of Georgia have told us is the count in Georgia. So we want to pressure, we who are, have no expertise, no knowledge, et cetera, we want to pressure by force you to actually elect someone else. We want to overturn a democratic election. Now, I think that, again, we will be helped by not having someone like Donald Trump in the position of the presidency at the time. And that will help a lot, because after all, if Donald Trump had said, okay, Joe Biden, I'm very sorry that I lost. I did the best I could. But I have to accept the people's voice. This is the people's choice, as all presidents before him have done. Well, then these folks wouldn't have been doing that.
Right.
And then to make the claims, and I have no idea what's really in Donald Trump's head.
I don't think anybody does.
To make the claims, which we know are untrue. That we know. That I do know. To make the claims that the election was a fraud, that the election was stolen from him, that he won Georgia by a large margin, for example, by a landslide, and won other states, won the country by a large margin. That is very unhelpful for democracy. But that's his pattern from day one. Back in 2016, the very first caucus, the first election, in other words, in which he was participating, that he's ever participated in, was the Iowa caucuses, and he lost. He lost to Ted Cruz. And so what was his response right then? He claimed, and I don't mean quietly, I mean publicly, he went on TV and immediately said, Ted Cruz stole this election from me. That's what he said. It's a public record, so there's no secret about this. I have not revealed the secret here.
Right.
But people tend to forget. That's his pattern. in 2016 in November, and he lost the election by 3 million votes. He lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. What did he claim? He claimed that, well, those were 3 million fraudulent votes, and they were all, of course, for his opponent, for Hillary Clinton. There were no fraudulent votes for him. 3 million. They were all illegal aliens, right? Who now he's had control of the Justice Department, the FBI, every single U.S. attorney as a Trump political appointee in the entire country.
And he
right?
appointed a number of federal judges under his.
Well, but what my point is, they've not been able to find these votes, these illegal votes. I mean, every one of them had an incentive to make themselves look good and please the president, right?
Right.
And he would have been extremely pleased. And they couldn't find any of these 3 million, at least, right? 3 million illegal votes, and they couldn't find one. Now, that's kind of odd, don't you think? So what we really have is the pattern of a president making stuff up, not telling the truth, excusing his performance. And I think that's what's happening now. Well, we're not going to have that again. If Joe Biden should run for re-election 4 years from now and lose, he will accept the results graciously as soon and you know, that night, if it's very clear, or you know, the next day or the day after that, he will immediately begin a transition to the presidency.
Well,
of the winning candidate.
In contrast to that, when you think of the George W. Bush and Al Gore, and George W. Bush wins the presidency very, very closely. Bill Clinton, even, kind of, he may not have been happy about it, may not have loved it, but there was a transition, and it was a peaceful transition. And we have continued to have that up until our most recent. So,
right. And we've always had that. We've always had that. And in modern times, presidents have typically gone out of their way to help the new president. And of course, President Trump has never been known for his graciousness, and he's been very ungracious. I mean, that's a relatively small matter. I mean, not inviting Biden to the White House, not attending his inauguration. There's only two presidents who haven't attended inauguration of their successor, and one of them was also impeached, Andrew Johnson. So it just shows, it just tells you a lot about Donald Trump, and we're not going to have that next time.
Right.
And that, so getting back to your question, that will help a lot. We need to depolarize.
And, yeah, we really do.
Yeah.
And I think this was really not a question that was kind of on the docket, but it just kind of makes me think, and I'm okay if you say you're not sure, you'd rather, pass on the question. But so right now we have the matter of impeachment that has come up. And there's a lot of folks who are saying, should we do this? Should we not? Should the Senate be taking up time to debate this? It's going to happen past the transition. My personal feeling is, let's keep on it, because at the end of the day, if you impeach him on both sides, then there would be no opportunity for him to come back.
Well, that's a second vote, but you have to impeach him first.
Right.
If you have to convict him of impeachment, he's been impeached again. He's been impeached.
True.
You have to convict him of impeachment, and then there's another vote, and that's when you disqualify him for future office. And so it's necessary to go through the trial in the Senate. And I don't expect that, frankly, he will be convicted, but I think it would be appropriate for him to be convicted, but I don't think he will be convicted. Now, there's a broader issue that you also raised, which is the trade-off between doing this and working on the new president's agenda, particularly when we're facing multiple crises. We're facing clearly a crisis in the economy, clearly a health crisis, and the president has been doing essentially nothing about this at all since the election.
Yeah.
I mean, literally nothing. And we've had a serious cyber attack from Russia. And we have there's many of other things, but these are not small things. These
No,
are
they're
not.
not. And
So
we haven't even talked about the Russian thing.
right,
It hasn't even been in the mainstream for a
right.
while.
So
But
we don't want to just put all this aside. And so there is a trade-off. And so it could be costly. And one of the things that President-elect Biden has done, and I haven't heard the answer to this. Maybe I just missed it, but I haven't heard the answer yet. He put a question through Senator McConnell to the Senate parliamentarian and asked whether you could have a dual track. So the Senate could have a trial of the president at the same time, or, like half the day, let us say, and at the same time be working on legislation and nominations from the new president. And the new president also needs to get his people in place. So there's a Secretary of State, for example, and a Secretary of Defense, etc. And that's important Senate business as well. So I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if there is the answer yet, but we know that President-elect Biden is concerned about this and has not been pushing impeachment. He's kept his hands off that. So I don't know how that's going to play out. And I think that Kevin McCarthy, who's a Republican leader in the House, has proposed to Speaker Pelosi, but was turned down, but proposed a strong bipartisan censure motion, censoring the president for his behavior. And I'm kind of attracted to that, to tell you the truth. To get this done, to get a very, very bipartisan statement, and it would be bipartisan. There would be lots of Republicans who would vote for the censure, both in the House and the Senate, and it would clearly pass both chambers. And so I think that there is something to be said for that option. But the Democratic leadership, and apparently in response to the rank and file Democrats in the House, wanted to pursue an impeachment. And it is what the president did is a very serious matter. And there hardly anyone in the House debate was justifying what President Trump did. I mean, a few people did, but mostly they were not. They were talking about other things, but they weren't justifying what the president. They weren't saying, "Oh, that was fine. That was just fine. That's good behavior, appropriate behavior, acceptable behavior."
yeah, no, I kind of share your thoughts on that, and I think there are many others who do as well. And I like exploring the topic. I respect other people's point of view. I hope that what I love about your point of view is that it is based on a lot of very thoughtful and well understood knowledge of how the process does work, should work, and how this is a little bit crazy times that we have experienced lately, and I hope that we don't ever experience them again. Don't think it's good for our country, but really looking forward to seeing what happens next. And would, in considerations of our topic around the Electoral College, would hope that this makes it into the main stage as well as a topic of discussion. I know it has a few times. There's folks who raise opposition to it, but at the end of the day, it is probably the one thing that would not only give people the greatest voice, but I tend to think it may also help in breaking some of the partisanship, because it would force people to work together a little bit more. At least
Well,
I hope.
yeah, we can all hope. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, George, I sincerely appreciate your time, your wisdom, your knowledge, your experience. It was just a great conversation. I loved having you on. Just before we go, though, I do want to ask, anything that you're working on right now, or anything that is out there that you would maybe like to promote, or people want to learn a little bit more about you and some of the works that you've written, where might they go?
Well, I have just finished a book, which will be out in the spring, about Donald Trump's leadership and the leadership of the public and leadership of Congress. which is really leadership because those are people who don't have to do what he tells them to do, unlike the people who work in the executive branch, right? And Donald Trump was unique because he came as a world-class self-promoter, and that's his business has been promoting himself, promoting his brand, and very, very good at it. And he's the author of The Art of the Deal. He said, I am an experienced negotiator. I'm really great. And so I can negotiate with Congress. So the question was, could someone with this background actually do that? Could he win public support for his policies? And could he negotiate deals in Congress? And the answer turned out to be no. The public has not supported any thrust of his policies, whether it's, and then this is amazing because you give people a tax cut, normally they would like that, you would think. People did not like the tax cut. They did not like his health care plan. They don't like his immigration policies. They don't like his free trade policies, or I should say restrictive trade policies. So he failed in all those regards. And of course, he's had the least success of anyone that I can think of in modern times with Congress. And so he never passed a single immigration bill. Never passed. Didn't pass health care. Didn't pass infrastructure. These are things he campaigned on and did not pass. He did get a tax cut. So I don't want to dismiss that. And Congress passed some other things in which he had very little to do with. But the real point is, he didn't do much. It wasn't a legislative presidency. It wasn't that left legislation on the books for future generations. And so that tells me a lot about the nature of presidential leadership. My argument about presidential leadership is that presidents can't do these things in general anyhow. But I thought, well, Trump is an exception because of his unique background. Let's test this. Let's see if someone with this background can actually lead. And of course, with his many personal failings and his personal style were detrimental to the cause. His cause got in the way, and so the combination was failure to move the public, failure to move Congress. And along the way, because of this style, I think he hurt the polity by corroding discourse and misleading the public. And I think these are very bad things. Unfortunately. And it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or conservative or a Republican, liberal or conservative, still bad to corrode public discourse because we all suffer. It's not like, well, that gives a great advantage to conservatives. It doesn't. And conservatives are not naturally corrosive in discourse. They don't, I mean, I don't make any, I have no idea like that in my head at all. So, at any rate, that's the bottom line on that.
No, that sounds
it's
very
called Changing Their Minds in question mark. Yeah.
That sounds very fascinating. And so you said that should be out spring, summertime?
Spring, yeah, it's supposed to be May. University of Chicago Press.
Awesome. Well, fantastic. I would love to reach out to you again and maybe have you back because I would love to learn more about that and maybe promote that a little bit. I would love to read it first so I could have a really good discussion with you about it. But I think the study of leadership, which is something that I do get into a lot, this is really going to be a very interesting case for years to come in all the things we should not do.
Right.
All right. Well, folks, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up our conversation here. George, thank you so much for jumping on with us this evening and sharing your thoughts. For everybody else, I do appreciate you guys dropping in, listening to the show. Next week, we have another interesting topic, and we're going to be talking to a very interesting podcast. Folks know that I had Karen Stalls on my show a little while back. We were talking about politically correct language. She's a linguist. But one of the other things she does is co-host of a show called Monster Talk, talking about all sorts of different monsters, if you will. So I know politics to monsters. What do you know? But anyways, folks, if you want to join us again next week, I would greatly appreciate it. Thanks so much for checking out Satisfactionist, and we hope to see you back soon. Thank you very much, and good night.